Everyone knows the world wars in Vietnam, but 10 conflicts most people have never heard of left marks on the modern world that rival them all. From corporate-fueled border wars fought over oil that never existed, to proxy conflicts that killed 1 million people while superpowers looked away, these are wars erased from mainstream history, yet their consequences still define today's borders, governments, and power structures. We're counting down from number 10 to number 1, each entry more consequential than the last. By the time we reach the top, you'll understand why the most world-shaping wars are often the ones nobody remembers. Our countdown begins with a conflict that lasted 100 hours, but whose fallout is still unfolding today. In the 10th place, the football war between El Salvador and Honduras erupted in July 1969, lasting just 100 hours, but leaving consequences that still ripple across Central America. Beneath the headlines about a World Cup qualifier, the real story lay in decades of migration and land disputes. By the late 1960s, more than 300,000 Salvadorans, roughly 1 in 10 people in Honduras, had crossed the border seeking farmland and work on banana plantations. Tensions simmered as Honduran authorities began expelling Salvadoran families from disputed plots, while both governments failed to resolve overlapping claims from the 1913 border treaty. The 3-match football series, culminating in a riot in San Pedro Sula on June 27, 1969, became the spark. Police logs from that night recorded 28 deaths and 300 injuries as soldiers fired into crowds and nationalist slogans filled the air. Within weeks, Salvadoran aircraft struck Honduran airfields, and ground forces advanced across the Cerro Grande front. The war claimed between 1,500 and 2,500 lives, with hospital records showing about 4,000 wounded and police reports documenting over 2,300 detentions. As the fighting ended, nearly 70,000 Salvadoran migrants fled Honduras, returning to overcrowded settlements and deepening the region's social displacement. United States Embassy cables reveal frantic shuttle diplomacy, as American ambassadors warned that further escalation could invite outside interference. Washington offered to mediate, proposing a joint commission and economic aid tied to land reform, but both governments rejected international oversight. The violence, brief as it was, hardened borders and set the stage for stricter migration controls and new waves of displacement, a pattern that continues to shape debates over Central American migration to this day. The football war stands as a reminder that a single flashpoint, even one sparked by a soccer match, can crystallize deeper struggles over land, identity, and the right to move. Number 9. The Chaco War unfolded between Bolivia and Paraguay from 1932 to 1935, transforming the arid Gran Chaco into a battleground, not just for territory, but for the promise of oil beneath its soil. Over 100,000 soldiers and civilians lost their lives in 3 years of trench warfare, disease, and relentless heat. The roots of the conflict lay less in national rivalry than in the boardrooms of multinational corporations. Standard Oil of New Jersey, with drilling rights in Bolivia, and Royal Dutch Shell, holding Paraguayan concessions, each lobbied their governments for control of the Chaco, convinced vast oil reserves waited underground. Internal memos from both companies, later uncovered in corporate archives, show executives pushing for military action, pressuring diplomats to secure favorable terms. Arms import manifests from the period list shipments of French artillery and German Mauser rifles, paid for in part by advances from oil interests. Diplomatic notes exchanged between South American capitals reveal how the promise of petroleum shaped every negotiation. Even as the region's geology ultimately disappointed, no major oil fields were ever found. The war's toll was staggering. More than 100,000 casualties, out of populations barely reaching a few million. left both countries scarred. When the ceasefire came, Paraguay emerged with nearly 3/4 of the disputed Gran Chaco, gaining access to the Paraguay River and, with it, dreams of future prosperity. Bolivia, landlocked and defeated, lost its hope for an oil-fueled economic revival. The Chaco War stands as a stark example of how speculation and corporate lobbying can turn a remote wilderness into the center of international conflict. Its legacy endures in the way resource claims still ignite border disputes, and in how multinational interests can shape the fate of entire nations, often with little regard for the people caught in the crossfire. In 8th place, the Winter War between Finland and the Soviet Union stands as a case study in how the perception of military strength can ripple far beyond the battlefield. When Soviet troops crossed the Finnish border in November 1939, the Red Army expected a swift victory. Instead, Finnish defenders, outnumbered and outgunned, used the dense forests and deep snow to their advantage. At the Battle of Suomussalmi, Finnish casualty records list around 250 killed, while Soviet losses reached nearly 1,000 dead, 2,500 wounded, and 3,000 captured in a single engagement. By the end of the war, Soviet casualties approached 126,000 compared to 25,000 Finnish dead, a disparity that reverberated through diplomatic cables and intelligence reports across Europe. British and French dispatches from early 1940 reveal a flurry of debate about possible Allied intervention, but fear of provoking a wider war with the USSR led to hesitation. Meanwhile, German intelligence analysts tracked Soviet failures closely. Reports compiled for Hitler's War Council highlighted Soviet logistical breakdowns and morale issues, shaping German assumptions about the Red Army's capabilities. In May 1941, minutes from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht show Hitler referencing the Finnish example as evidence that the Soviet Union could be toppled quickly. This belief played directly into the decision to launch Operation Barbarossa, with the expectation that Soviet resistance would collapse in the face of a concentrated assault. The Winter War ended with the Moscow Peace Treaty in March 1940, forcing Finland to cede territory but preserving its independence. Yet the conflict's true impact lay in the way it altered strategic calculations at the highest levels of power. A small nation's refusal to surrender and the staggering cost it imposed on its adversary helped set the stage for the largest invasion in history and for the catastrophic losses that followed. Number 7. The Paraguayan War stands as one of the most devastating demographic catastrophes in recorded history. Between 1864 and 1870, Paraguay confronted the combined forces of Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay in a conflict that left scars still visible in the nation's social fabric. Pre-war census registers placed Paraguay's population near 500,000, and by the war's end, fewer than 100,000 remained. Contemporary demographic studies, drawing on parish records and military muster rolls, estimate that 80 to 90% of adult males perished, an erasure so complete that entire generations vanished from the record. The war's origins lay in a tangled web of territorial ambition and foreign financing. Brazil's elite sought unfettered access to the Paraguay River, while Argentine leaders aimed to assert dominance over the Rio de la Plata basin. British arms merchants, operating through private channels, supplied the Triple Alliance with rifles and artillery, paid for through London credit lines that would later underpin Brazil's industrialization. Letters preserved in the Internet Archive, titled Letters from the Battlefields of Paraguay, reveal the mindset of Marshal Francisco Solano Lopez. By 1866, his orders reflected a growing paranoia. insisting that surrender is a betrayal of the fatherland. The same correspondence describes mass executions of civilian men after the fall of Asuncion, as the Allied armies advanced through the countryside. The demographic collapse was not simply a matter of battlefield casualties. Civilian men were conscripted en masse, and as the war dragged on, boys and elderly men were pressed into service. SAS Space Demographic Analysis confirms that by 1871, the male population over the age of 15 had been reduced to a fraction of its pre-war size. The gender imbalance would shape Paraguay's society for generations, influencing marriage patterns, inheritance laws, and even the structure of rural communities. The country's loss of access to the sea, codified in post-war treaties, left it landlocked and economically dependent on its neighbors, a status that persists to this day. The legacy of the Paraguayan War endures not only in the country's borders, but in the memory of loss carried through family histories and national myth. The scale of destruction, an 80 to 90% loss of adult men, remains almost unimaginable, a stark reminder that the consequences of war can outlast the ambitions that ignite it. Number 6. The Greco-Turkish War of 1919 to 1922 marked a turning point in the Eastern Mediterranean, not only through military confrontation, but by setting a precedent for state-driven population engineering. In the wake of World War I, Allied powers, seeking to reward Greece for its support, authorized Greek troops to land in Smyrna. Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos championed the Megali idea, envisioning the unification of all Greek-speaking lands under a single flag. Parliamentary transcripts from Athens in 1919 document his call for reclaiming the Christian heritage of Anatolia, while nationalist pamphlets urged volunteers to join the campaign. Yet the Greek advance was met by a disciplined Turkish resistance led by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who mobilized remnants of the Ottoman army and local militias. Secret records from the Turkish Grand Assembly reveal Ataturk's determination to build a secular, sovereign republic from the ashes of empire. The war's conclusion was not simply a matter of shifting front lines. The Treaty of Lausanne in July 1923 codified a compulsory population exchange on an unprecedented scale. According to official registers, approximately 1.5 million Greek Orthodox Christians were expelled from Anatolia, Thrace, and the Aegean Islands, while 500,000 Muslims were forced from Greece. The League of Nations Convention on the Exchange of Greek and Turkish Populations, annexed to the treaty, detailed the process. Relocation was mandatory, supervised by an international commission, and to be completed within 2 years. Each government assumed responsibility for transport, food, and medical aid, though the reality often fell short, with deaths and hardship recorded in both Greek and Turkish archives. This legal framework transformed forced migration from a wartime atrocity into a tool of diplomatic policy. The Lausanne Clauses, Article 1 declaring the exchange, Article 2 making it compulsory, were cited in subsequent international agreements, setting a precedent for state-sanctioned demographic engineering. For Greece, the influx of refugees reshaped urban centers and strained the economy, while for Turkey, the emptied lands enabled agrarian reform and the consolidation of a secular national identity. The population exchange remains a reference point in contemporary debates over minority rights and migration policy, echoing in modern EU-Turkey negotiations and shaping the region's approach to refugee crises. The Greco-Turkish War's legacy lies in its transformation of the Eastern Mediterranean's demographic map, and in the enduring legal and political structures it left behind. Number 5. The Congo Crisis of 1960 to 1965 unfolded in the wake of independence. as the newly sovereign Congo became the stage for a Cold War power struggle that would reverberate across Africa. Within days of the Belgian withdrawal, the mineral-rich province of Katanga, backed by Belgian mining conglomerate Union Minière du Haut Katanga, declared secession. Financial ledgers from Brussels detail how Union Minière transferred millions of francs to Katanga's accounts, funding mercenary forces and securing continued access to copper and uranium, resources vital to Western economies and nuclear programs. In Washington, declassified dispatches from CYA Station Chief Larry Devlin reveal a strategy of covert intervention. Devlin's cables, now housed in the U.S. National Archives, describe direct coordination with Moise Tshombe and the channeling of funds to anti-Lumumba factions. The CIA's priority was to prevent Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba from seeking Soviet support. When Lumumba did appeal to Moscow, the response was swift. On January 17, 1961, Lumumba was executed by Katanga's forces, an act facilitated by both Belgian officers and Congolese rivals. Forensic records and Belgian parliamentary inquiries later traced the chain of custody from his arrest to his death, confirming Western complicity at the highest levels. The United Nations, under Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, launched its largest peacekeeping mission to date, yet internal UN memoranda, later released from Hammarskjöld's personal papers, reveal the limits of international authority. Hammarskjöld's secret negotiations with both sides, including a fateful flight to Ndola in 1961, ended with his death in a mysterious plane crash. The official investigation left critical questions unanswered, fueling suspicions of sabotage linked to foreign intelligence services and mining interests. The human cost was immense. Contemporary estimates place the death toll at approximately 150,000, including civilians killed in ethnic massacres and military operations. United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees archives document hundreds of thousands displaced, with entire communities uprooted during the Katanga secession and the subsequent rebellions in Stanleyville and Kasai. The crisis did not just redraw Congo's political landscape, it set a precedent for the fusion of corporate power, foreign intelligence, and authoritarian rule. With the support of Western governments and mining companies, Joseph Mobutu seized power in a coup in 1965, inaugurating a kleptocratic regime that would rule for over 3 decades. The mechanisms refined in the Congo, resource-backed financing, covert operations, and the use of international peacekeeping as a shield for intervention, became a template for future proxy conflicts across the continent. The Congo crisis stands as a stark example of how the scramble for resources, masked as ideological rivalry, can shape the fate of nations long after the last shot is fired. Number 4. The First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895 marked a turning point in East Asian power, lasting less than a year, but redrawing the map for generations. At the heart of the conflict stood 2 empires on opposite paths: a rapidly modernizing Japan fueled by Meiji-era reforms and British-financed shipyards, and a Qing dynasty struggling to adapt as the world changed around it. The Japanese Navy, equipped with new steam-powered cruisers and trained under German naval doctrine, confronted China's Beiyang Fleet in the Yellow Sea. Official logs from the Battle of the Yalu record the destruction of 8 major Chinese warships, nearly a third of the Qing's modern fleet, while Japanese losses amounted to only 4 minor vessels. The defeat sent shockwaves through the imperial court in Beijing, exposing the limits of the self-strengthening movement and igniting debates over how to defend the realm in an age of industrial warfare. The war's conclusion was sealed in April 1895 with the Treaty of Shimonoseki. Under its terms, China ceded Taiwan and the Penghu Islands outright to Japan, surrendered the strategic Liaodong Peninsula, and agreed to pay an indemnity of 200 million taels of silver, an amount so large that the Qing government was forced to secure emergency loans from British and Russian banks. Japanese officials, led by Foreign Minister Mutsu Munemitsu, insisted on the cession of Taiwan as a demonstration of their new status as a modern imperial power. For the first time, a non-Western nation had decisively defeated a major European-backed empire, and the world took notice. British newspapers ran headlines declaring Japan's arrival on the world stage, while Western diplomats recalibrated their alliances in the Pacific. Consequences for China were immediate and profound. The indemnity payments triggered a cycle of foreign debt and internal unrest, accelerating the decline of the Qing dynasty and fueling movements for reform and revolution. In Tokyo, the victory legitimized the Meiji government's modernization drive and provided the resources, both financial and territorial, to expand further into Korea and Manchuria. The cession of Taiwan marked the beginning of Japanese colonial rule on the island, setting patterns of governance and economic development that would persist for decades. The war's outcome also shifted the balance of power in East Asia for the next half-century, laying the groundwork for future conflicts and for the enduring rivalry between China and Japan. The First Sino-Japanese War stands as a reminder that even brief wars can reshape continents, redraw borders, and launch new chapters in the struggle for regional dominance. Number 3. The Angolan Civil War stands as one of the longest and most complex proxy conflicts of the late 20th century. When Portugal's colonial rule collapsed in 1975, Angola's independence was immediately consumed by a war that would last nearly 3 decades. The stakes were never just national. Within months, the Marxist MPLA, led by Agostinho Neto, faced off against UNITA and FNLA, each faction drawing support from rival superpowers. The Soviet Union funneled arms and advisors to the MPLA, while the United States and apartheid South Africa covertly supported UNITA, fearing the spread of communism in southern Africa. Yet it was Cuba's intervention that proved decisive. By late 1975, Havana had dispatched approximately 36,000 troops to Angolan soil, the largest overseas deployment in Cuban history. Diaries kept by General Arnaldo Ochoa, later published in fragments, detail the planning sessions in Havana and the logistical feat of transporting thousands of soldiers and tanks across the Atlantic. Cuban forces, fighting alongside the MPLA, turned the tide at the Battle of Luanda, preventing UNITA from seizing the capital and securing the new government's survival. But the war did not end with the first victories. Instead, Angola became a Cold War chessboard, with Soviet cargo manifests listing MiG fighters and T-55 tanks arriving in Luanda, while South African units crossed the southern border, launching raids deep into Angolan territory. Oil and diamonds fueled the conflict, both as sources of foreign exchange and as spoils for whichever faction could control the fields. Chevron and Total, two of the world's largest oil companies, lobbied international diplomats for stability, their contracts with the MPLA providing the government with critical revenue to purchase arms. Arms manifests from the era show a steady flow of weaponry, often paid for with future oil deliveries rather than cash. The resource wealth that should have built a nation instead entrenched a cycle of violence, as rival groups fought not only for power but for control of Angola's natural riches. The toll was staggering. Over 1 million people lost their lives, and more than 4 million were driven from their homes. many forced into sprawling refugee camps along the borders with Zaire and Zambia. For ordinary Angolans, decades of war meant shattered families, collapsed infrastructure, and a generation raised amid uncertainty and fear. The war's duration magnified its impact. Children born in the first year of fighting often reached adulthood before peace was declared. The endurance of the MPLA, propped up by oil rents and foreign military aid, created a government that survived not through consensus, but through a perpetual state of emergency. As the Cold War ended, international pressure and exhaustion finally pushed the warring parties to the negotiating table. The 2002 peace agreement left Angola's borders intact, but did little to resolve the deep fractures left by a conflict that had become a template for proxy warfare in Africa. Today, Angola is one of the continent's leading oil producers, yet the legacy of war lingers in its political culture and economic disparities. The Angolan Civil War remains a stark example of how external intervention, resource wealth, and ideological rivalry can lock a nation into decades of instability, with consequences that extend far beyond its frontiers. The Iran-Iraq War erupted in September 1980, when Saddam Hussein's forces crossed the Shatt al-Arab waterway into Iran, igniting an 8-year conflict that would claim around 1 million lives. The war's staggering human cost, 500,000 casualties on each side as recorded by the International Committee of the Red Cross, was matched only by the scale of its devastation. Trench warfare reminiscent of World War I stretched across hundreds of miles, while air raids and missile strikes battered cities and oil facilities. Chemical weapons, once taboo, became a tool of attrition. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons archives confirm hundreds of chemical attacks, with mustard gas and nerve agents deployed against Iranian soldiers and Kurdish civilians. Medical records from Ahvaz and Tehran hospitals describe survivors left with chronic respiratory disease, blindness, and genetic disorders that persist to this day. What allowed the war to grind on for so long was not just the tenacity of the combatants, but the steady flow of resources from outside powers. Declassified National Security Council memoranda from the Reagan administration reveal a policy of containment. The United States, determined to check Iran's revolutionary regime, quietly approved export licenses for dual-use technology to Iraq between 1982 and 1988. U.S. Department of Commerce files list turbine parts, communication systems, and chemical precursors, materials with civilian uses but also essential for Iraq's military buildup. Shipping manifests from companies like Kellogg and Texaco show petroleum-grade chemicals and industrial inputs bound for Iraq, some later diverted for chemical weapons production. This external support created a paradox. While Washington condemned chemical warfare in public, internal documents show a willingness to enable Iraq's war effort as a counterweight to Iran. The conflict spilled into the Persian Gulf, where the tanker war saw both sides target oil shipments. Lloyd's of London insurance records from the era detail dozens of tankers struck by missiles or mines, disrupting global oil flows and driving up prices. The U.S. Navy intervened, reflagging Kuwaiti tankers and escorting convoys through the Strait of Hormuz, militarizing the Gulf and setting the template for future American involvement in the region's security. The war's legacy is not just the million dead, but the precedent it set for chemical warfare and the entrenchment of sanctions and proxy conflicts that followed. The use of chemical weapons during the Iran-Iraq War remains a reference point in debates over international law and the authority of the OPCW, especially in later crises in Syria and Iraq. The conflict's endurance, enabled by global politics and the calculus of strategic interests, reshaped the Gulf and left scars that define the region's geopolitics to this day. And finally, in first place, the Congo Free State stands as the template for corporate state extraction and the birth of industrial-scale genocide. Between 1885 and 1908, King Leopold II of Belgium ruled the Congo as his personal possession, not as a colony of the Belgian state, but as a private enterprise. The entire territory became a vast labor camp designed to feed the booming global demand for rubber. Concession contracts with companies like the Anglo-Belgian India Rubber Company, known as ABIR, set quotas so high they could only be met through forced labor and terror. The consequences were staggering. Historians estimate that between 5 million and 10 million Congolese died during Leopold's reign, a loss equal to 10 to 20% of the population. The violence was systematic. The Force Publique, a private army paid directly from Leopold's coffers, enforced quotas by taking hostages, wives, children, and elders, and by mutilating those who failed to deliver. The severed hand became the most chilling currency of the regime. Soldiers were required to bring back a hand for every bullet fired, as proof that ammunition had not been wasted or used in rebellion. Missionary Alice Seeley Harris captured the horror in a 1904 photograph. A father in Sala sits before the hand and foot of his 5-year-old daughter, cut off after his village failed to meet its rubber quota. Baskets of hands were delivered to company agents and officers as a grotesque form of accounting. This practice was confirmed in the British Confidential print and in Roger Casement's 1900 report to the British Parliament. Casement's investigation, based on hundreds of interviews and testimonies, documented the routine collection of hands and the direct orders from Leopold's administrators to maximize rubber output by any means necessary. The Congo Free State was not just a story of brutality, it was a business model. ABIR's annual reports, preserved in the Belgian Royal Archives, detail profits funneled directly to Leopold's personal treasury, while American and French investors joined the rush for rubber concessions. Foreign companies, eager to share in the profits, turned a blind eye to the atrocities. Diplomatic immunity and legal ambiguity shielded Leopold from prosecution, as the Congo was treated as his private property, exempt from international law and scrutiny. British journalists and missionaries mounted a global media campaign, publishing photographs and witness accounts in the Times, but economic interests in Congo rubber limited the appetite for intervention. Even after the Casement report exposed the scale of the violence, European governments hesitated, unwilling to jeopardize their own corporate stakes. The legacy of the Congo Free State reaches far beyond the colonial era. The same patterns of resource-driven violence and foreign-backed extraction persist in the Democratic Republic of Congo today, where cobalt and coltan, essential for smartphones and electric cars, are mined under conditions that echo the abuses of Leopold's time. The template established in the Congo, the fusion of corporate profit, state violence, and legal impunity, still haunts global supply chains. The photographs of severed hands and the millions of lives lost are not just a record of the past, they are a warning that the machinery of exploitation, once set in motion, can outlast its architects. The Congo Free State stands at the apex of this list, not only for the scale of its destruction, but for the way it forged a system that continues to shape the world's economy, borders, and moral conscience. Across all 10 conflicts, a clear pattern emerges. The wars that most reshape nations are often the ones history forgets. Lines on today's maps, the rise and fall of regimes, even global markets, trace directly to these overlooked struggles. The true architects of the modern world aren't always found in textbooks. They are hidden in forgotten battlefields. Understanding these wars means understanding the world we live in. Which conflict surprised you most? Let us know in the comments.